Good morning. To start off, I have to let you know that Mr. Ken Higgins, our Vice President of the Global Manufacturing and Engineering Group, wasn't able to make the trip today, so sorry to say you're stuck with me as being the sole presenter. Owens, Illinois is a glass container manufacturer. And as director of the Facilities Advancement or Facilities Engineering Group, my group has sole responsibility for all of the engineering projects related to the manufacturing facilities. So today, as I go through the presentation, I'll start out and give you a little bit of background on what Owens, Illinois is, what we do, discuss some of the project types that the engineering group gets involved in, some of the results that we've observed since we've implemented the critical chain methodology within the engineering group, go through that story of the implementation, discuss some of the obstacles that we've seen and some of the success factors that we've been able to realize as a consequence of the implementation. We'll go through some of the lessons learned, very important, as we look at a global rollout for the implementation and what is ahead for us as part of that rollout. So Owens, Illinois truly is a global company. We manufacture glass containers, bottles and jars. And in 2009, we had over $7.1 billion in net revenue. We've got over 22,000 employees globally. We've got 78 plants in 22 countries, and we've got over 1,900 worldwide patents associated with the glass manufacturing process. Now, as you would imagine, being global, we've got 13 official languages within the company, so that presents numerous challenges in and of itself as we look at a global deployment for a critical chain. Our world headquarters is located in Perrysburg, Ohio, and that's where I'm based. And we have approximately 75 engineers within the engineering center, and that's split between two offices, one in Perrysburg, Ohio, and the other one in Loren, Peru. So what I'm going to go through and describe to you today is the implementation that took place just within the North America engineering organization, but that also includes the engineers that are located in Peru as well. So what was the goal and why were we looking at implementing critical chain? A couple of very good reasons for that. What we were looking at was a need for a 30% increase in our engineering design throughput for the facilities advancement or the facilities engineering group compared to 2009. And the reason behind that was that in 2010 we were expecting a 25% increase in the CapEx spending compared to the 2009 baseline. And in addition to that increase in the CapEx spending, we tend to see an increase in the need for engineering projects towards the end of the year in order to use up all the CapEx for that given year. So we end up with a real peak load of engineering projects right in the fourth quarter. So when we looked at all those things, it was pretty obvious to us that for 2010 we were going to be woefully short on the engineering capacity that we had in the organization to be able to meet those demands. So the types of projects that we get involved in are related to engineering to order projects for the furnaces, the forming machines, and all of the facility systems that are required to support the rest of the operations. And those projects range from just normal maintenance to systems upgrades, any regulatory projects that are required for environmental compliance, and also when we have production capacity expansions. We need to go in and, say, basically flip the factories to give us that additional capacity. So why do we need these projects? We have maintenance on our aging furnaces and our forming machines. Now, for the furnaces, they will typically last 10 to 12 years. Now, in that life cycle, roughly 5 to 6 years, we may have to go in and do a partial repair on the furnace, or when it comes to the end of that life cycle, we have to go in and perform a complete major, so basically taking the entire furnace down from the ground up, possibly even including the steel work. So a pretty significant project. Now, in addition, we're constantly being faced with meeting changes in market demand. So we have to go in, whether we have to remachine, increase the capacity on the machines, always great opportunities there that present themselves at the drop of a hat. And then within our R&D organization, they're constantly looking at developing new technologies. So we end up having engineering projects associated with delivering those new technologies to the factory floor. So what have we accomplished so far with the help of realization relative to the deployment of the critical chain? What I'm showing here is, if you look at the lower line, it's the 2009 actual throughput for our engineering projects throughout the year. And you'll note as we get towards the end of the year, November, December timeframe, there's that year-end peak load that we always have to deal with. So in the January-February timeframe of 2010 is when we implemented the critical chain. And we started out in January slightly higher than the 2009 baseline. And you'll see a nice steady increase in the project throughput. And up through August of this year, we basically had completed the equivalent of 11 and a half months of engineering projects compared to 2009. So I think for us, a real success. So the results, we started out with our targeted throughput increase of 30%. And we go through some peaks and valleys of being able to hit that number, but right now we're pretty close to that 30% throughput increase. And perhaps what is even more impressive to us internally is in regards to the furnace design cycle times. And we have reduced those by approximately 60%, going from 6 months down to approximately 2.5 months. Now, the basis for taking on these furnace projects before, the norm was the project would come in, we would assign one lead engineer and a CAD operator, and those individuals would work on that project from start to finish. Now, with the help of critical chain, what we identified is that within that furnace design process, there are basically 3 discrete parts of the furnace that get designed. So what we've done is separated those 3 design areas and have resource loaded each one of the design areas in and of themselves and working on all 3 in parallel. So that's really been the benefit that's allowed us to realize those kind of gains. So the additional benefits, excuse me, the increased throughput is obviously going to help us manage that 2010 year-end peak demand that we seem to face every year. And additionally, it's given us the opportunity that we're now looking forward to the projects that are coming in for 2011 and starting to work on those projects in 2010. So the benefit of that is that we'll no longer be the constraint for the system as we look towards 2011. Now, additionally, the other thing that we have to deal with is the decreased cycle time is going to help us complete emergency projects faster. And with the changes in business demand that end up coming up throughout the year, we get these emergency projects that get thrown into the engineering bucket, unplanned, unscheduled, so we have to deal with those. So what we've gained so far will really help us out in being able to complete those projects as well. And one added benefit, too, is that having a pipeline where we have all the projects scheduled, we've got a master schedule that is showing our projects, basically out through the next year and a half to 2 years, provides visibility to the customer now that we can go back to them and say, these are the anticipated completion dates for your projects that you've provided to us. So where we started. Back in 2009, we had completed approximately 46 engineering design projects. And at the beginning of 2010, when Realization came in and started to work with us on critical chain, we had approximately 32 active projects at that time, of which 5 were furnace, 5 were machine, and we had 22 other projects. We had, at that point in time, no resource loading associated with those projects. We really had no clear visibility on what the status was of any of those 32 projects. So if the customer were to walk in and say, where is my project right now, nobody could really give them a clear answer to what the status was. And as a consequence of all these issues, obviously we had no clearly defined approach to synchronizing the projects themselves or synchronizing the resources to go ahead and effectively complete those projects. So with the help of Realization, we started to take some pretty aggressive steps on how to get our arms around this whole engineering process that, quite honestly, was really in chaos at the time. So we cut our WIP by 55%. We went from 32 projects down to 15 and froze those 17 projects that we pulled out, I'll say, of the pipeline at that point in time. And we implemented full kitting and release control of the projects. So what that allowed us to do with the release control was to go ahead and complete one project, then we'd bring one of the frozen projects in, and in a methodical fashion go through and work that backlog down. So we had quite a few of those 32 projects that had been started, stopped, that were well overdue, to the point of some of those projects, the manufacturing group had forgotten that they had even wanted those projects done. So some real issues there. In order to help us get through those projects, we built and customized templates, which for the first time really put structure around all the work that we had ahead of us. And we completed software training throughout the organization, training in Concerto, as well as training in critical chain, and that was both in the Perrysburg office as well as the Lorin, Peru office. More importantly, we began to follow the buffer signals to manage the projects, so we had an understanding of what projects were in jeopardy, where we had issues, so that was very important to help us move forward. And we initiated a series of meetings, a series of weekly meetings, starting with daily stand-ups. So the engineering disciplines that are involved in those meetings are civil structural, mechanical, electrical, furnace design, process control, and product handling. So each one of those disciplines has their own daily stand-up meeting at 9:15 every morning, and via teleconference they tie in the resources from the Lorin, Peru office as well. During those meetings, they take a look at primarily just tasks, not full-blown projects, but just tasks, and identify if there's any issues or barriers associated with them being able to complete those tasks. If they do identify some problems, then those get bumped up to the daily escalated task meeting that takes place at 9:45 every morning. And in that meeting, the resource manager is dealing with the task managers and trying to identify what's required to eliminate those issues and barriers to be able to move those projects forward. Now, once a week, I'll have my staff meeting, which includes the project managers and all the task managers, our master scheduler, and the resource manager. And during that meeting, the project managers will go through and for each one of the red projects, will identify what their plans are in terms of buffer recovery to get the projects back on track. So the one thing that these meetings have, I say, really accomplished within the organization is one of communication, which never really took place before. So it really has been a tremendous benefit throughout the entire organization for us. So progress. Shown here is a bar chart indicating red project delay from the start of the deployment, beginning with the January-February timeframe. So as we began to implement the methodology and the processes, it was pretty obvious that we were seeing some real benefits associated with reducing the red project delay. In other words, the delay in days between the projected project finish versus the required due dates. And it's pretty obvious that when we started the whole process, we weren't doing a very good job in terms of getting projects completed on time. But we were feeling very good. We were making progress. We were heading in the right direction. So things were working well. Then what happened? Things kind of got derailed a little bit when we had a couple rather massive projects that got dumped into our laps because of a big change in the business. And this was not where there was a lot of consultation taking place relative to can you go ahead and handle these projects. It was when will you get these projects done. So all of a sudden, we had a huge increase in WIP, and obviously things started heading south pretty quick, and the delays started going up. So what happened? We basically did everything wrong. On rule number 1, the WIP increased significantly because of these large emergency projects. And quite honestly, it ended up being essentially the heaviest workload that the organization had in memory. So these were indeed massive projects that got dropped in on us. Full kitting was compromised. It wasn't a question of having all the right information. Again, it was just the question was when are you going to get them done? So we spent an awful lot of time working on pipelining the projects and trying to set the priorities, and just really kind of got away from all of the things that we had learned in the weeks prior to that. When you look at rule number 2, as we put the project templates in for these emergency projects, cycle times kind of went out the window. It was due to best guess, and the project schedules, quite honestly, did not reflect the reality of the complexity associated with the projects. Rule number 3, as a consequence of all the chaos that was going on through the entire organization, it got to the point where the managers, task managers, just really disregarded red tasks in terms of setting priorities. So they started going by gut feel on which tasks they really needed to be working on, and just really working really hard to try and get the projects done, but just not setting the proper priorities. So what do you do then? Through numerous meetings with Realization, we decided that we would have a intervention workshop. So we brought the folks in and sat down, had a meeting with upper management on the first day, and then the second and third day we sat down and really started to dig through the details of what had derailed the process. So we took a look at the WIP and went in, first thing, cut the WIP and reinforced that rule with the customer and tried to do a better job of bringing the manufacturing management into our process, which up to that point, I don't think we'd really done a very good job of communicating with them. So also as part of that engagement, we shared full kit responsibilities with the customer and added full kit metrics to the project managers to, I guess, better drive their oversight with regards to the projects. One very important thing that we did is we added a formal weekly template customization meeting where the project managers would sit down with the task managers and go through very specifically the scope and details of the project, make sure that they had the right dependencies in place, and really put together a good plan for proper execution. We also went through and changed due dates or reduced cycle times associated with projects so that we didn't put projects into the pipeline with buffer consumed already. In fact, we had gone, especially with these emergency projects, threw those into the mix and perhaps at that point might have had 200% of buffer consumed already. So it was something we definitely need to make a change in. And the other point was that we added metrics to try and do a better job of driving the right behavior within the organization. And as part of that, in working with Realization, we developed a decision path diagram to help us through those steps to make sure that we were taking a look at the right things, the critical items that we had to deal with. So here's the example of what the decision path diagram looked like. And we'll start on the upper right-hand side. And the first question, are we meeting the business needs? Are we meeting the down dates? And do we have the queues properly set up and staged? And in the case at the time that we implemented this, the answer was no. So moving down to, is the throughput target being met? And at that point we weren't. We had dropped off, obviously, on the performance. So we went to, are the rules in control? And what we ended up having to do was obviously say no. So is the WIP low? No. So the first thing we dealt with was the WIP. Once we got that corrected, we moved over to, is the full kitting occurring? And are engineering change orders low? So at the time, the answer to that was no. So we fixed the full kitting process, but then we also put in a formal process for engineering change orders that would occur during the middle of a project and significantly impact the scope, so we could get our arms around responsibilities associated with those engineering change orders. In other words, were the projects not being scoped properly up front, or was the change in scope due to field discovery? So that helped us. And once we got that situation resolved, we went over to the due dates being met, and the answer to that was obviously no. So we fixed the buffer management and started to pay attention, or better attention, to the project metrics. So once we got that piece fixed, then we went over to the update compliance and priority compliance and working with task managers to get them back on process such that they were following the buffer management signals. So this was the results that we were able to observe after the intervention workshop. And obviously it took us some period of time to go ahead and implement these changes, get things back on track. But you'll notice in the early July timeframe, once things had settled down, we had pretty much gotten back to the levels that we had been prior to the drop-in projects, and in fact even a little bit better. But then when you look at this, you say, well, okay, things have started to go back the other direction. I think really what this is associated with is getting into the vacation season and not really planning properly to account for having these resources being out for 1-2 weeks at a time on vacation. So that slowed the progress down. So lessons learned. It's been quite the story for us as we've gone through the whole process. But I think one of the most important lessons learned has been that sustaining the results requires using metrics, not to only provide the project status, but to drive the decision-making and corrective actions. So we've learned we really have to pay attention to the metrics. And in fact, we're taking a look at, I say, energizing the organization in terms of educating them on all of the concerto metrics. What do those metrics mean? And try and use those metrics to drive proper behavior within the organization all the way down to the performing resource levels. So additionally, a couple of other, I think, great lessons that we've learned. As your process improves and you make corrective changes, your drum resource may change, so be ready to act. We observed very early on in our process that our civil structural organization was the drum resource. So we went out and since that time have hired 3 additional resources, and all of a sudden we took care of that issue. However, the problem is we now realize that our new drum resource is our project management organization. We don't have enough project managers to properly scope the projects and get the pipeline filled and have full kitted projects ready to go. So you need to be aware of when you make correct changes, that issue may go someplace else. So that kind of leads into the second one of don't underestimate the importance of proper projects staggering and a full pipeline. We're kind of in a situation right now where we felt really good. We went through the intervention workshop, we made progress, we got things back on track, and then all of a sudden it's where are all the other projects that we need to start bringing into the pipeline. So need to pay attention to that. And I think lastly, this is a never-ending learning experience, and if you want to strive for continuous improvement, you really have to keep an open mind and be willing to learn new things and really pay attention to what the process is telling you, what the metrics are showing you. So what's ahead for us? As we've gone through the implementation, and it was about the second quarter that we also initiated the critical chain methodology in our European office, we've run into some roadblocks and barriers there. So next week, Realization and my team is heading off to Europe to implement some of the corrective actions that we had already implemented in the Perrysburg, Ohio office. Connecting project throughput to the bottom line. Being good engineers, we've focused on completing the design projects, but we've really not done a very good job of tying all the financials to the benefits that we're realizing. So we have to do a better job on that, and as a consequence, we're working with a financial group to try and get some numbers. And the next jump in improvement, I think we have a great opportunity ahead of us to take a look at reducing cycle time targets for the projects to get us above that 30% improvement goal. So that's next on the agenda, is to actually take a look at the processes that we're using within each one of the disciplines to try and cut down those targeted cycle times and task durations.